There are few people in history as ambitious, as murderous, and as responsible for the deaths of millions as the subject of today's video. Born to an ordinary middle-class family, dishonourably discharged from the Navy for womanising, he would go on to become the head of the Nazis' intelligence and secret police forces. His belief of an internal threat to the regime would cultivate a culture of fear and paranoia within Nazi Germany, and his desire to rid the regime of the perceived threat posed by Jews and those deemed degenerate would lead him to becoming the architect of the Holocaust, with the industrial murder of millions. In today's video, we will be covering the disturbing life, career, and death of Reinhard Heydrich. Heydrich was born on the 7th of March 1904 to a typical middle-class family. His father, Richard, was an opera singer and a composer. The young Heydrich engaged not only in playing the violin, but all manner of sporting activities such as fencing and swimming. His father wasn't very political, but was staunchly nationalistic, with much reverence to the state and the Kaiser. Following the defeat of Germany in World War I, Richard Heydrich struggled with a worsening of the country's economy. In post-war Germany, ridden with all manner of right and left-wing revolutionary groups, a 15-year-old Reinhard reportedly joined one of the many Freikorps. These Freikorps groups were right-wing paramilitaries made up of former soldiers. These groups would actively fight against communist revolutionaries in the streets, though whether the 15-year-old Reinhard Heydrich actually fought is unlikely. Following completing his education, Reinhard, instead of following in his father's footsteps, took up employment with the German Navy in 1922. During his training, rumours circulated that Reinhard was of Jewish ancestry, a rumour that would follow him for some time and cast aspersions to his loyalty to Germany. Many in post-war Germany sought to blame Jews for the defeat of Germany in the First World War. Nevertheless, he was able to rise the ranks and become a communications officer and reach the position of first lieutenant. During his time in the Navy, Reinhard engaged in a number of affairs with women, where he would promise to marry them. One father of one such woman, who was a high-ranking naval officer, took offence to Reinhard promising to marry his daughter before he had announced his actual engagement. For acting in a manner unbecoming of an officer, Reinhard was dishonourably discharged. The woman who Reinhard had actually proposed to was named Lena von Osten, and she would soon find work for her unemployed fiancé. Lena was already a member of the Nazi Party when she met Reinhard, with her brother also a member of a Nazi paramilitary group called the Sturmabteilung, or the SA. Through her connections, Heydrich was able to obtain an interview for a position working under the head of the SS, Heinrich Himmler. At the time, the SS was but a small bodyguard unit, but Himmler had desires to grow the organisation. Himmler thought that Reinhard had worked in the intelligence services, as during the interview he had inflated his own experience and was able to secure a position in the fledgling SS, with the task of setting up an intelligence service, what would become known as the Sicherheitsdienst, or the SD. Following Hitler's appointment as Chancellor of Germany in January of 1933, Reinhard was tasked with the gathering of blackmail and information on the political opponents of the Nazis. Such actions helped the Nazis limit their political opponents and enabled them to slightly increase their share of the vote in March of 1933. Reinhard and Himmler sought to consolidate their power by taking control over the Bavarian police force, whilst also taking over control of the Gestapo from Hermann Göring. All the while, the terror apparatus of the Nazi regime was coming into being, notably the concentration camps, starting with a camp at Dachau. Mass arrests of communists, trade unionists, and social democrats were being carried out, many ending up in these camps. Some 20,000 people were arrested in the early months of the regime, rounded up by the SA, and identified by Reinhard's ever-growing secret police force. As the Nazi Party sought to consolidate power and normalise itself with the German establishment, the question as to the power of the SA was a constant cause for concern. At over 2 million strong at its peak, it outnumbered the German army and presented itself as a revolutionary force. Its leader Ernst Röhm had even suggested that the army be replaced with the SA. but other leading Nazis realised they would need to keep the German establishment on side. Reinhard, Himmler, Göring and Josef Goebbels plotted the destruction of the SA and its leadership, with the SD drawing up the lists of those they would need to eliminate. Evidence of Ernst Röhm's plan to supplant Hitler was fabricated by the SS. Himmler's SS would then play a key role in the executions and arrests in what would be known as the Night of the Long Knives. We do have a separate and specific video on this topic, but the outcome was the reduction in power of the SA and the rise of the SS as the key organisation within the Nazi regime. Reinhard, as Himmler's right-hand man, would continue his meteoric rise through the Nazi power structures. Following the murder of a German diplomat by a Jewish teenager in Paris, Reinhard played a crucial role in the subsequent pogrom known as the Night of the Broken Glass, or Kristallnacht. Thousands of Jewish homes and businesses were destroyed and looted. Hundreds were killed by the apparent spontaneous acts of violence carried out by apparently ardent German citizens. In reality, much of the violence was carried out by Nazi party members or SA members, both in and out of uniform. Behind the scenes, Reinhard was coordinating the violence with the Gestapo, SD and the police. He ordered that members of his police forces break into synagogues and obtain the archives and information held on Jews in Germany. Some 20,000 Jews were arrested and sent to concentration camps, many of whom were murdered. Reinhard again showed his organizational capabilities, the reach of his security apparatus, and his desire to eliminate the Jews. One of his key philosophies was that the Nazi regime faced a number of internal threats to its survival, the main threat being that posed by Jews. From 1939, the SD and the police were formally linked together and placed under the command of Reinhard. People could be arrested on the basis that they might commit a crime, often ending up in concentration camps. Framed as being placed in protective custody, thousands were arrested and detained. Homosexuals, Roma, and those religious people who opposed the Nazi regime were all targeted to rid the Nazis of any internal threat. But the key threat identified by the Nazi Party was the Jews both within Germany and without, in what they termed as Judeo-Bolshevism. Some of the first attempts to deal with the Jewish question involved the forced expulsion of Jews from Austria, a program headed by Reinhard's SD. The man in charge of this office was an SS lieutenant named Adolf Eichmann, who would go on to play a major role in organizing the logistics of the Holocaust. Eichmann and the SD oversaw the expulsion of Austrian Jews, who were sent to Jewish ghettos in Poland, a way to concentrate Jews before deciding how they would be dealt with whilst removing them from society. From these ghettos, Jews would be ultimately transported to various concentration camps, and these camps had been built to house the Jews until death. Reinhard was impressed with Eichmann's initiative, elevating the lieutenant through the ranks and becoming his right-hand man. The Einsatzgruppen was another group created by Himmler and Reinhard. The Einsatzgruppen were mobile units of fanatical Nazis who operated behind the German army, carrying out massacres of Jews, Slavs and Communists. And they were used in Austria following the invasion of Poland and at the start of the Second World War. In what was termed Intelligii Action, tens of thousands of Polish immigrants were identified, rounded up and executed. Teachers, lawyers, members of the establishment, religious leaders, and all manner of intellectuals were targeted as a means to destroy the Polish national identity and to reduce the chance of any meaningful resistance movement. A list of some 61,000 people was prepared before the invasion, but in all, around 100,000 people were murdered in a sign of the methods to come, notably in how the Jews were dealt with by the Nazi regime. The methods employed against the Polish intelligentsia would be used again in 1941 and the invasion of the Soviet Union. The Nazi goals of creating a vast living space in the East and the destruction of Judeo-Bolshevism would be met with the invasion. Reinhard, like many Nazis, believed that the Jews and communism were biologically linked, and that the destruction of the Jewish people would also destroy communism. Again, the Einsatzgruppen squads followed behind the German army, though with their logistical support. the Einsatzgruppen were tasked with the destruction of all partisan forces and Communist Party members. Jews, however, were classed as partisans, regardless of their affiliation, age or gender. Children, the elderly, men and women were all rounded up, transported to often pre-dug graves, and shot. Those who were not massacred would be concentrated into ghettos, whilst it was decided just what would be done with them. In the first 6 months from the start of the invasion of the Soviet Union, anywhere from 800,000 to 1 million people were massacred by Reinhardt's Einsatzgruppen. As the Nazi forces pushed east and as more and more Jews were swept up in the advance, the methods employed to deal with the Jews were deemed insufficient. The manpower, the resources, and the physical effort on those carrying out the massacres was seen as too high of a cost. When Himmler visited a mass execution of Jews near Minsk in August of 1941, he vomited at the sight. More convenient methods of execution were ordered to be employed. Previous experiments with gas vans, where at first the mentally ill would be sealed into the back of vans with the exhaust fumes pumped in, proved to be the solution that would be employed. Reinhardt was tasked with coming up with the final answer to the Jewish question. In January of 1942, 15 of the highest-ranking Nazi officials attended the Wannsee Conference, with Reinhardt playing a lead role. The purpose of this meeting was to come up with the final solution to the Jewish question, meaning just how the Nazis would eradicate the Jewish people in Europe. The meeting was filled with euphemistic terms and how the Jews would be dealt with. Adolf Eichmann, who attended and took notes, recorded that the 11 million Jews of Europe would be worked until they would fall out by natural means, which meant worked to death. The remainder, deemed the strongest in terms of natural selection, would be murdered. It was in 1942 that steps were made to establish not only concentration camps, but death camps. The now infamous gas chambers were established in the likes of Treblinka and Auschwitz. This systematic murder of Jews, Roma, homosexuals, and all of those that the Nazis declared had no place in their world was possible, in no small part due to Reinhard Heydrich. As well as playing a key role in the planning of the Holocaust, Reinhard was appointed as the Deputy Reich Protector of German-occupied Bohemia and Moravia, this being the territory of then Czechoslovakia. He was sent to heavy-handedly deal with the Czech resistance to the Nazi occupation. The Czech resistance and the government in exile sought to disrupt the Nazi occupation and establish themselves amongst the Allies. When Reinhard arrived, he established martial law and executed a number of resistance fighters. Thousands were arrested and massacred. Czech culture was suppressed in favour of Germanic culture. Brutal violence and rewards for compliance were used to cement Nazi rule. But the goal from the very start was to pave the way for the displacement of Czechs to be replaced with ethnic Germans. But for all his high-ranking status and crucial role in the Nazi state, Reinhard was incredibly complacent and arrogant about his own safety. He had flown as a fighter pilot during the Nazi invasion of Norway until he was banned from flying by Himmler after he crashed his plane behind enemy lines. During his time in Prague, he often rode in an open-topped car with no security, save for his driver. This was despite Himmler's express orders to take his security seriously after witnessing firsthand his lax attitude. Reinhard posed a tempting target for the Czech government in exile, eager to prove themselves legitimate to the Allies while striking a blow to the Nazi oppressors. Working with the British, Operation Anthropoid was launched to assassinate Reinhard. Czech soldiers were trained by the British, supplied with Sten guns and grenades, and dropped into Prague in December of 1941. The two men heading the operation were Jan Kubis and Josef Gabček. They studied Reinhard's routine, the routine his car would take, and where would be best to launch an attack. The location for the attack that was selected was a hairpin bend on a road to his headquarters. This would mean that Reinhard's car would crawl to a slow speed, allowing for the assassins to strike. On the 27th of May 1942, the Czech assassins took up their positions and waited for Reinhard to arrive. As the car approached, Gabček took his aim with his Sten submachine gun, but as the gun was prone to doing, it jammed. Rather than escaping the assassins, Reinhard ordered his driver to stop the car so he could stand up and shoot them with his sidearm. Meanwhile, Kubis was able to make his way to the car unnoticed and threw a modified grenade designed to explode on impact. The grenade landed near the rear wheel of the car. The explosion tore through the right rear fender, the shrapnel of the grenade, car and seat ripping through Reinhard's spleen, diaphragm and lung. As the assassins fled, Reinhard was transported to a local hospital. The attack was met with outrage and dismay from the Nazi leadership, with both Himmler's and Hitler's personal doctors being dispatched to help with his recovery. Whilst attempts were made to recover the shrapnel, and despite signs of improvement, Reinhard died on the 4th of June 1942. The cause of death is thought to have been sepsis, and the sepsis is believed to have been caused by a horsehair that became lodged inside Reinhard. The hair in the upholstery of the car seat would have been shot into Reinhard during the explosion, leading to his death. Whilst Reinhard was buried with full honours, the people of Czechoslovakia faced huge reprisals. Hundreds were massacred in the town of Lidice, a town thought to be home to many of the Czech army in exile. As many as 5,000 people were murdered in response to Reinhard's death. As for the assassins, they went into hiding, but as the Nazis threatened to massacre even more civilians, it became increasingly more difficult to remain hidden. The location of a number of resistance safe houses were given to the Gestapo, who in turn carried out raids. In a grim example of the methods employed to locate the assassins, a 17-year-old was shown the severed head of his own mother. This was done to break his resolve and reveal the location of the resistance fighters responsible. Eventually, the assassins and a number of Czech resistance fighters were located, hiding at the Church of St. Cyril and Methodius in Prague. All were either killed in the attempt to arrest them, or they took their own lives. The death of Reinhard did not stop the Nazis from continuing their plans to exterminate millions of Jews. The year of Reinhard's death saw the largest number of people murdered during the Holocaust, as Operation Reinhard was in full swing. The plan for the destruction of the Jewish people was outlined in the Wannsee Conference, and bore its architect's name long after his death. His close companion Adolf Eichmann would continue Reinhard's work, organizing much of the industrial-scale genocide. Reinhard was ambitious and ruthless. He is arguably the man most responsible for what one thinks when discussing Nazis. He played a crucial role in creating the oppressive police state, oversaw the rise of the SS, and was tasked with deciding just how Hitler's goals in the destruction of the Jewish people was to be implemented. The crimes and the victims of Reinhard Heydrich are many and ought to never be forgotten.